What I think is really interesting about this collection is the artefacts themselves, and also what it tells us about both the limitations on the collection and also about how things might be seen in the future. So what we've got here is a collection of things that are to a certain extent representative of what we see in our society, but it's also got a series of restrictions on it. First restriction, interestingly enough, I think, is that the material that we're seeing here is stuff that people value enough to have, but don't necessarily value enough to spend a lot of time and energy to go and get back, because when they've lost it. The second restriction that we've got on it is that this is material that people have handed in, or have found, whether that's somebody cleaning the bus or somebody who sees it that someone's dropped it and they've handed it in. So, and that's not to say that people wouldn't hand in something very valuable, but it's interesting that none of these things are extremely valuable. And the third thing is the limitations on what you can actually put into a display such as this, so something that isn't specifically identifiable to an individual, that sort of thing. So we've got some restrictions on this collection that we're seeing here, but most people wouldn't necessarily know about those restrictions or think about them. So people in the future would think that this was perhaps a representative sample of, for example, the sort of shoes that we would get. The other interesting thing about the shoes, which are one of the biggest groups that we can see in the collection, are that those shoes, we know that they're, for example, men's shoes or children's shoes or trainers and things like that, but that's because we understand our social background. We understand our society and the sort of things that we have in those collections and the sort of things that we see. But people in the future wouldn't necessarily understand that that was definitely a child's shoe or that was definitely an adult man's shoe as opposed to an adult woman's. If they don't have the information that we have about our society and that we know because of when we've grown up and who we've spoken to, and our own understanding, they might think that these are all special shoes, for example. Well, these have been kept when everything else has been thrown away and gone into rubbish. These shoes have been kept, so they must be special in some sort of way. Might be the way that they would look at it. Perhaps this is a ritual deposit. And so actually looking at this collection is really interesting because we can look at it and say, what questions would people ask of this in the future and what wouldn't they know in order, so they would come up with perhaps answers that aren't correct. And then we can look at that and go, well, do we need to think in the same way and have the same cautions in our head when we look at stuff from the past? So the sort of information as archaeologists that we might find things that have been thrown away, we might find things that have been lost, and we might find things that have been deliberately placed somewhere and then not come back for. So examples of things that have been thrown away, rubbish pits, things like that, midden heaps, and stuff that's been spread on the fields. Things that have been lost, well, if something's been lost, then we probably aren't going to find things that are of great value. So if you lose a bronze coin in the Roman period, well, that might be, a quarter of a day's work or something like that. Particularly if you drop it down the cesspit of your toilet, you're probably not going to go scraping around in the bottom of it to try and find it because it's not worth very much. On the other hand, you don't tend to find very many gold coins even at the bottom of cesspits. Now, that might be because they're rarer, but it might also be that people attach a little bit more value to it. Like if that's worth an entire year's worth of work, then you're going to put a little bit more effort into finding it. So it's our understanding of context, of understanding what it is that we're seeing. We have to be a bit careful when we're looking at things in the past, because perhaps the sort of thing that we would use something for isn't the way it would have been used in the past. We understand the context, but we also have to understand the limitations on what we're finding, that we're finding things that people have thrown away, lost, or have deliberately put into the ground. We can't always be sure why they deliberately put into the ground, because it's the way that we would do things. It isn't necessarily the sort of way that they would do things as the same as us, basically. So really, really interesting collection, but as interesting for what's not there as for what is.